Every year, nearly 42 million people are affected by outbreaks that could have been prevented with knowledge humans already discovered hundreds of years ago. But here's the question almost nobody asks. What if the medieval world actually solved problems we still struggle with today? And what if those forgotten solutions could save us right now? Imagine this. It's early morning, and you're walking through a quiet European village. Not in 2025, but in the year 1338. The mist clings to the rooftops, the streets are still, and the world seems painfully simple. Yet beneath that simplicity, medieval people were fighting invisible enemies we still battle today. Pandemics, misinformation, food shortages, collapsing systems, and natural disasters. And here's the shocking part. Many of their methods worked far better than we think. Recent historians have started re-examining dusty manuscripts, monastic journals, and city council records. What they found wasn't chaos, but patterns, strategies, systems, not the barbaric backwardness that movies show, but early versions of public health, disaster control, community intelligence networks, and even psychological resilience techniques that modern scientists say are surprisingly effective. Between 1300 and 1500, Europe faced over 90 major crises, from plagues to famines, yet entire regions survived because they developed clever, practical methods we've quietly forgotten. And when a top historian finally compiled them, he made a chilling argument. If medieval Europe had not invented these survival techniques, half the world today would not exist. Now the real question for us becomes, if these methods saved lives, then why did we stop using them? And more importantly, which ones still work today? Maybe better than ever? Let's start with one of the most misunderstood eras in history, a time of fear, faith, and incredible ingenuity. You've heard the stories. Dirty streets, sick peasants, superstitious villagers, angry kings. But what you haven't heard is that certain medieval communities had something close to an early warning system for disease. Not magic, not prayers alone. Real data, real observation, and real results. In the small port of Ragusa in 1377, city leaders noticed something terrifying: ships arriving with dying sailors. Other ports panicked. Ragusa didn't. They created a system so powerful that even modern epidemiologists say it is shockingly advanced. They isolated arriving travelers for Trentagiorni, 30 days. Later, Venice expanded it to Quarantagiorni, 40 days. That word eventually became quarantine. But here's the twist. Quarantine wasn't just isolation. It was a multi-step protocol based on behavior, environment, and risk, something modern health authorities would later rediscover centuries later during COVID-19. Medieval physicians also monitored things modern medicine sometimes ignores: animal behavior, unusual smells, humidity changes, and sudden patterns in communities. Because they didn't have microscopes, they relied on pattern recognition, and it worked. Monks in northern Italy kept detailed logs of symptoms, food shortages, weather, and trade routes. Some experts today call them the first data scientists. But survival wasn't only about disease. Medieval people had psychological techniques we might laugh at today, until we realize they line up perfectly with modern neuroscience. Take ritual structure, for example. When people lived through constant danger, they created daily routines built around movement, sound, and repetition. Today, psychologists know that structured micro-rituals reduce anxiety, improve cognitive clarity, and slow the body's stress response. Meditation apps claim to be modern inventions, but monks in the 1200s already used the same principles. Even disaster communication, something we still get wrong, was shockingly effective in several medieval cities. Instead of chaos, they had runners, bell towers, coded lantern signals, and local council rules that told every citizen exactly what to do when danger arrived. And the most surprising part? Some of these communities had community resilience networks, groups who trained specifically to handle crisis. Not soldiers, regular people, bakers, farmers, widows, servants, and apprentices. History's stereotype calls medieval people passive and powerless. Reality shows the opposite. They were problem solvers who built systems so durable that modern researchers now call them medieval technologies of survival. So, how did one historian bring all this lost knowledge back into the modern world? And what medieval techniques still work better than anything we use today? The answers lie in 5 major discoveries he made, fragments of medieval brilliance pulled from forgotten archives. He spent decades traveling from monastery to monastery, flipping through parchment so old it crumbled when touched. He found secret letters between city leaders, coded notes from guild masters, emergency plans written in the margins of prayer books, and medical tips disguised as religious proverbs so the church wouldn't censor them. What emerged wasn't a random collection of medieval ideas, but a system, a blueprint, a survival framework built across centuries of trial, error, and incredible ingenuity. And now we're finally ready to break down that system, the medieval techniques that not only still work today, but might be the key to solving some of our biggest modern problems. The first technique he uncovered was something that sounded deceptively simple: crowd mapping, not digital maps, not satellite scans. It was medieval cities quietly tracking human movement long before anyone invented the term population flow. City scribes in Florence and Lubeck kept records of who visited markets, who traveled on certain roads, where the most foot traffic appeared on specific days, and how people reacted to rumors or unusual events. They did this not for curiosity, but for survival. If a disease, a fire, or a hostile army appeared, they already knew exactly which routes would clog, which markets would collapse, and which neighborhoods needed the fastest intervention. Modern urban planners now call this behavioral flow analysis. Medieval cities had it centuries before anyone thought the Middle Ages contained anything intelligent at all. The historian spent years analyzing these documents. He noticed patterns the original scribes didn't fully explain: how crowds moved before outbreaks, how farmers changed travel routes before famines, how traders avoided certain inns when rumors spread. He realized medieval communities had a kind of intuitive data system, not charts, not graphs, but lived memories stored in councils, guilds, and church records. Even more surprising was their ability to forecast crises based on these patterns. For example, in the 1400s, a small town in the Alps noticed that shepherds were coming down from the mountains earlier than usual. They interpreted it as a sign of bad weather coming, a harsh winter, so the town stockpiled grain and wool. The following winter was brutally cold, one of the coldest in that century. The town survived. Most of their neighbors didn't. This wasn't magic. It was observation, careful, generational, relentless observation. The historian called this medieval predictive intelligence, and his research showed that it still holds value today. Long before governments invented forecasting systems, ordinary medieval people watched nature, animals, and human behavior as if their lives depended on it, because they did. But the second medieval technique was even more surprising: resilient local networks. In modern cities, people depend on national governments, huge infrastructures, and supply chains that stretch across continents. Medieval societies didn't have that luxury. So villages, guilds, and small neighborhoods built small-scale support webs to withstand crises. A baker wasn't just a baker. He was part of a fire watch team during summer months. The candle maker kept emergency oil for lamps used only when the town crier needed to send night warnings. Blacksmiths repaired tools across households without payment during harsh winters, because survival depended on it. If someone fell ill, neighbors brought food, tended fields, or looked after children, not because of charity, but because cooperation was a currency of survival. Modern psychologists studying disasters say that communities with strong local bonds suffer far less trauma, less panic, and recover faster. And yet, we've forgotten this completely. Medieval people didn't wait for a government order. They acted for each other long before crisis arrived. The historian found letters from peasant families showing detailed lists: who was responsible for what during flood season, where animals should be moved first, which children belonged with which family if something happened. This wasn't superstition. It was disaster management. But the third medieval technique was perhaps the most impressive: layered defense. Modern people think of defense as soldiers, walls, and weapons. Medieval people saw it differently. Their strongest defenses weren't built from stone. They were built from time. They staggered risks. They slowed threats. They broke crises into phases. If disease hit a village, they didn't shut everything down at once. They isolated individuals first, then households, then streets, then parishes, not because they understood bacteria, but because they understood patterns of spread. If a fire started, they didn't rush blindly. Every street had assigned water teams, tool carriers, and signal keepers. Every home was inspected twice per year for fire hazards, something many cities today still fail to enforce. If an enemy army approached, towns didn't rely solely on walls. They used terrain bottlenecks, stone piles prepared at choke points, and even sacrificial fields designed to slow cavalry. Sometimes these crude strategies were so effective that modern military historians call them early asymmetric defense. The historian realized something modern people almost never consider. Medieval Europe was constantly under threat. Their entire way of life depended on reducing, delaying, and redirecting danger, not eliminating it completely. And those strategies worked because they were simple enough to execute fast and flexible enough to adjust. Then came the fourth medieval technique, the one the historian believed could fix an enormous modern problem: knowledge vaults. Today, information is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But medieval societies treated knowledge like a survival resource. Monasteries kept records not only of religious practices, but of weather changes, crop cycles, medicinal herbs, and community behavior. Guilds kept trade manuals and secrets in coded form. Town halls kept annual reports of prices, production, and disputes. These vaults weren't designed for scholars. They were designed for future, so the next generation could avoid repeating the same catastrophe. During one famine in northern France, monks recorded which plants grew best in dry soil. 80 years later, when a drought returned, another abbot consulted the old parchment and saved thousands from starvation by reintroducing those forgotten crops. The historian discovered a chilling pattern. Communities that preserved knowledge survived. Communities that didn't vanished. And then he uncovered the fifth technique, the strangest one, a method so old, so superstitious looking, that modern people mock it. But neuroscience now confirms its surprising power: symbolic coping. Medieval people used stories, rituals, chants, communal meals, shared symbols, and seasonal festivals not just for religion, but to stabilize the mind. When danger struck, they didn't drown in fear because their entire culture was built on repeating messages of endurance, renewal, and unity. They used sound, chanting, bells, processions to regulate emotional states. They used color, banners, robes, candles, to anchor attention. They used repetition, prayers, cycles, customs, to reduce uncertainty. Modern therapists now call these collective grounding techniques. Medieval people mastered them centuries ago. When the historian presented his findings at a modern conference, many experts were shocked. How can an era known for plagues, wars, and superstition be filled with such practical intelligence? But they missed the point. Medieval people weren't geniuses. They were desperate. And desperation pushes humans to discover solutions we later forget because we consider them too simple. But here's where the story shifts. Because after documenting these techniques, the historian realized something even more alarming. Modern society has abandoned nearly all of them. He began comparing medieval crisis survival to modern failures: pandemics, food chain instability, psychological collapse, misinformation chaos. And he argued, with data, that many of today's disasters grow stronger not because we lack resources, but because we abandoned ancient strategies that once kept humanity alive. He made a bold claim: the medieval world was not behind us. In many ways, it was far ahead. And if that statement is true, then everything we think we know about progress might be wrong. The historian then sought out the most compelling evidence he could find: lost records from forgotten villages whose survival techniques were centuries ahead of their time. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the truth became, because some of these techniques weren't merely forgotten. They were intentionally erased.